Welcome to App Stories, a weekly exploration of the world of apps. Today's show is brought to you by Linode and Luna Display. I'm John Voorhees, and with me is my co-host, Federico Viticci. Hey, Federico.
Hello, John. How are you?
I'm hanging in there. You know, we've had some busy weeks here,
Did we?
and the reality is we're only just starting. I mean, you and Ryan just launched a new show on Relay FM called Adapt,
Yeah.
and today you launched your big iPad story. So that's I feel like we're maybe almost 10% of the way there, given what I know about our schedules. But it's been a lot of fun.
Today's a good day. Today's a beautiful day, John. I've been working on this story for almost 3 months between taking notes and initial research and then the actual writing. So I basically was not expecting to be publishing an iOS review before the actual new version of iOS
Right.
is announced, but that's what I did, essentially.
So, Federico, it's not September. What are you doing? I mean, what got into you?
All right, so to give you some context before we talk about the actual story, because I bet that you're going to have some questions. Today on MacStories.net, you're going to find this big story that I've been working on. It's called Beyond the Tablet, 7 Years of iPad as My Main Computer. So a few months ago, when I was planning the stories that I wanted to have on the website before WWDC, I realized there's two things that I would like to have on Mac Stories before I leave for San Jose. I wanted to do an iPad story and I wanted to do an Apple Watch story, because I felt like I wanted to go to the conference and have ideally both of them, but at least one of them up on the site so that people could, maybe read the story when they were traveling, or just, have something big on the website before WWDC. Because after WWDC, things kind of get lost, and it's hard to get noticed and it's hard to make an impression because everybody's just paying attention to the betas.
Right.
And this was February, I think. When I was trying to decide which one to tackle. And the more I kept thinking about it, the more I realized, I want to do the iPad one for a variety of reasons. I felt like, and I was proven right considering my schedule, that I couldn't do two major stories in 3 months.
Right.
So, of course, that was insane to think about. But also, it felt like the right opportunity to recap all of the work that I had been doing on the iPad before WWDC. So, like, as a final update on all the things that I've been doing on the iPad, all the things that I've been testing with the new iPad Pro since November 2018, before iOS 13, which in theory should have major changes to the iPad. So my idea was, I'm going to write a story that tries to have the most complete account of all my iPad experiments and my workflows and the accessories that I use that I've ever published. So a few factors played into that. For example, I received the review units for the Bridge keyboard and the Logitech Slim Folio Pro. And so that kind of allowed me to have a dedicated external accessories chapter. Then I also started playing around with the podcasting setup that Jason Snell came up with a few months ago. So a few changes in recent months, combined with other changes that my setup has gone through since iOS 11 and iOS 12, they all sort of came together in this one massive story that's really got the same scope of an iOS 12 of an iOS review. I think the final word count is somewhere in between 49,000 and 50,000 words. So that was my approach.
Right. I remember when you first told me that you were thinking about doing these stories, and they really didn't sound this ambitious or massive back in February, because you could see it developing. I guess it was things like the podcasting setup that you were implementing and the external hardware and other things that really got the ball rolling, because I guess I didn't feel like you were going bananas with the story until maybe a month to a month and a half ago, but I guess the seeds were planted back in February, and you like to keep things under your hat for a while sometimes, so I'm not surprised.
Yeah, initially it was just going to be, I think, a story about iPad file management and what I had been doing with shortcuts and Scriptable on iOS. And then it sort of evolved into the idea of, instead of doing like, because at some point I wanted to do like separate posts for the Bridge keyboard and the Slim Folio Pro.
Right.
And so the initial idea was, I'm just going to be talking about software. So it's going to be a smaller story, which was why I thought that I was going to be doing both the iPad story and the Apple Watch story. But then I realized, why don't I make it? And this was a couple of months ago. Why don't I make it a bigger story that truly makes an impact? And why don't I also give it a special layout, which is the special story layout with the table of contents, that I usually use for my iOS reviews. This story has that special layout, and it features, there's some changes in the visual department in terms of the introductory animation and the chapter images that we've been using. So I went all out and basically I followed the same process that I follow for an iOS review. There's a special layout on the website. There's special graphical assets that I commissioned for the story. There's an ebook version. We're doing this podcast all about this story right now. And there's going to be a special making of, actually a couple of special making of columns in Mac Stories Weekly for Club Mac Stories members later this week. One by me and one by Brian King, who's the animator and video editor who worked on the 3D assets for this story. So a bunch of new things, because of course, when I want to do something big and sort of have this kind of a event type of story, of course I want to overcomplicate my life and say, well, I guess I'm just going to do, hire a professional 3D artist to do all the images.
Yeah. No, I know.
That's what I do.
Yeah, it is what you do. And then there's just like one day, a 3D image of your desk just drops into my into iMessage. Like, what are you doing? And then I learned about Brian, and Brian King's going to join us a little later in the show to tell us a little bit about what that was like, because it's really kind of an interesting story in and of itself. And of course, Club Mac Stories members can also enjoy an ebook version of your iPad story. So that's pretty cool. You can download that at club.macstories.net if you're a member. And we're going to talk, I guess, today a little bit about that and a little bit about the process behind putting together the story. I don't want to rehash everything that's in your article, because people ought to go read that for themselves. And there's 50,000 words there. We'd be here, I think, the rest of the day if we if we did that. But I do want to highlight like a few issues and a few things in it that I found particularly interesting that I think would be good topics for this show in particular. And the first thing I want to talk to you about a little bit comes down to the process. And that is, I know that you've been working in IA Writer, and I know that you've also been working with that in conjunction with working copy. But even before we get to the working copy stuff, which I find really interesting, and I think there's some really good tips there that people might find interesting. But I want to talk to you a little bit how you put together the book, the actual compiling of both the book for the ebook and for the web, because you're using like file includes in IA Writer, and I want to understand a little better about how that works.
Yeah. So both the ebook and the web version, they all share the same Markdown source. So plain text, everything is written in Markdown,
right,
with the addition of some special syntax tags that we use for Mac Stories. So for example, the videos and the cover images and the aside boxes in the review, those are all special syntaxes that we use for Mac Stories, but generally speaking, it is all multi-Markdown. The story was all written and edited in IA Writer. I did not use an additional text editor because it's something that I used to do in the past. This was all done in IA Writer. And one of the features of the app is called content blocks. A content block is a reference to a file that is stored in IA Writer and that you want to embed in another text file. So in my case, I had 6 text files, one file for each chapter of the review. So chapter 1 was the introduction, chapter 6 was the conclusion.
Right.
The idea was I want to be able to edit and write these chapters individually. I don't want to have a single, review or like story.md file that was going to be too long to scroll and too difficult to navigate. I wanted to break it down into multiple files. But also I needed to export a full version containing all the files,
Right.
Containing the contents of all the files at the end. So what I did was I created a compiled draft document in IA Writer, and I used content blocks to generate a version that included all of the chapters that I needed. And the syntax is very simple. Maybe we can put an image in the show notes or somewhere to give listeners an idea what it looks like.
Sure.
It looks like you are embedding a URL, but it's actually a local document. So the syntax will be something like /one introduction.md. It looks like a link in IA Writer, but when you hit the preview feature or when you export the document, that reference takes the contents of the file that you're referencing and embeds that content in the final export, in the final output. So that's a way for me to have a single text file that contains 6 content blocks that actually become 50,000 words when you hit the export button, because
Wow.
it compiles the contents of those files. But I did something more though.
Okay.
This is what I showed you last week. I
Right.
created 2 different compilers for the ebook version and the web version. The web version has some differences from the ebook one. For example, there's in the web version, the first sentence of the story is not part of the main body text because it goes into a custom field in WordPress, so it needs to be excluded. Or the web version has a sponsor that is not displayed in the ebook.
Right.
The web, there's some minor syntax differences in between the ebook version and the web one. So what I did was I created 2 separate compilers, like 2 separate master notes, you want to call them. They're basically like a structure. They're like a skeleton of the sections that you want to include. And that allowed me to have the same underlying chapters, but slight differences during the export process. So that when I hit the export button, I knew that the ebook syntax was always going to be correct. And I knew that the web syntax was always going to be correct. I can tell you, John, this has been a major annoyance for all the time, for all the reviews that I've done over the years, and I finally fixed it.
Yeah, because you're constantly then you're like, oh well, I have to change this one word, and I have to change it in 2 places, and then you end up with something that's inconsistent because you maybe miss it in one place. Yeah, that is amazing to me. All right, so when you're putting in these content block references, how do you do that? Are you typing these out and making sure you get the file names right, or are you dragging in the files from the the sidebar in IA Writer? I use IA Writer, but I've actually never used these content blocks myself.
So you can type them manually, but what I like to do is actually I swipe on a text file. I hit the more button, and then I tap rename, and a dialog comes up, and it contains the full file name. So what I do is from an external keyboard, I do Command A that selects the entire file name. Command C to copy. I dismiss the alert. Then I go back to the text. I type a / and then I paste. So it's just a way to make sure that I copy the exact same file name from the library of the app. I don't like to type file names manually because I know I'm gonna have some typo or something. So
right. I mean, if you have an extra space or something, it wouldn't work, right?
Yeah, it would break and it wouldn't actually generate the content block that you gotta generate. So that was such a major change in terms of how I manage this, a story of this scope. First of all, because it's just easier to have individual chapters. For when a story gets this large, it's just better for me to be able to go into the introduction and say, okay, this is 1,000 words. This is easy to edit. And then I have file management, which is like 15,000 words, and then multitasking. It's just easier to jump from chapter to chapter this way. But also, I have a way without having to write a script or do some crazy automation to have compiled versions that do not have any syntax mistakes in them, and that also take a second to generate. So I was very happy with my approach here.
Yeah, that's interesting because, I'll tell you, it's when you're dealing with 50,000 words, you would send me, this is my behind the scenes, you would send me review.txt, which is it was the markdown file that we would use to generate the ebook. And that thing had all 50,000 words in it. And yes, if you wanted to find something specific in there, it was not easy because it was just a really long document. And so breaking things up like that makes a lot of sense to me. So I guess based on what you've said, you're going to be using this over the summer for your iOS review too, right?
Oh, absolutely. My main concern at this point is I hope that iOS 13 does not introduce any major bugs or like changes that are going to break iWriter, because I would like to work on iOS 13 with iWriter. I just fear that, it's going to be a beta. So I'll have to figure it out. Like, I have two iPads, an 11-inch iPad Pro and the 12.9-inch iPad Pro. I got to figure out where I want to write and where I want to put iOS 13. But maybe, it'll have new features, but they won't break the app. But yes, to answer your question, my plan is to absolutely continue using iWriter and all of these features that I also described in the story, because this is like what I like about this story is sort of the meta aspect of, in some sections, it's a story that describes the story itself.
Right.
Yeah, with the file management stuff and all of that.
This episode of App Stories is brought to you by our friends at Luna Display. They're the makers of the only hardware solution that turns your iPad into a wireless display for your Mac. That means you'll have a second display that's super portable, basically has zero lag, and has gorgeous image quality. I use it all the time. Sometimes when I'm sitting at my desk, I use it as a reference display. That means if I'm doing a podcast like I am now, I can have audio hijack on my iPad thanks to the Luna Display, so I can ensure and see that everything's recording properly while I look at the show notes on the main display that I have attached to my Mac Mini. It's really great that way. No matter what kind of project you have, having that ability to have a second screen with reference material and things that are ancillary to what you're working on your main display is an excellent solution, and a Luna Display makes that possible. Setting up an extra screen can be really fiddly, but Luna Display couldn't be easier. It's just a little bit of hardware that you plug into your Mac, and you're good to go. Plus, everything works on Wi-Fi, and if you don't have Wi-Fi, you can use a USB cable too. It's super simple to set up, and you'll love that extra screen real estate. It's a complete extension of your Mac too, so that means your keyboard works with it, and the Apple Pencil too. That means you have touch interactions on a Mac display. It basically turns your Mac into a touchscreen device. And the all-new Liquid Video Engine brings significantly reduced latency and a faster screen refresh rate. Listeners of App Stories can get 10% off the Luna Display. Just go to lunadisplay.com and enter the promo code STORIES at checkout. Again, that's lunadisplay.com and the promo code STORIES at checkout. So don't delay. Go there now, upgrade your setup. You're going to love it. lunadisplay.com and the promo code STORIES to get that discount of 10%. Our thanks to Luna Display for their support of the show. So, iWriter, you use the content blocks, but you also used it with working copy. And we've talked here and there about how we use working copy at Mac Stories. But I think, to me, as I read through your story, the thing that was most intriguing to me was not just that you use working copy to sync your stories, including this one, to GitHub, where Ryan and I can look at them, edit them, and do whatever else we're doing with them. But you have actually included all of your entire folder structure in iCloud Drive into working copy for iWriter, so that everything that's in iWriter is on GitHub. Is that correct?
Yes. My entire iWriter library, which is stored in iCloud Drive, is mirrored to GitHub, to a private repository there. Yeah.
So why would you do something like that?
There's a couple of notes there. The first one is I want to be able to have Ryan and other, maybe you, take a look at the things I'm working on. So instead of having to export and remember to overwrite previous drafts, I want to be able to have a simple system where all of the things that I'm working on for the website can be accessed by you and Ryan. And it's just easier for me to have a system where it's almost automatic, in that I just need to remember to open working copy and save my changes and push them to GitHub. Also, this allows me to take advantage of working copy and its support for synced directories. So, working copy has some writing tools that IA Writer does not have. So, for example, comparing differences between versions of the same document.
Right.
Using a working copy, I can take a look at my history of commits. Commits would be when the saves of a document, like every time you save a new version, you create a commit. This is a GitHub terminology. It can be weird and difficult to explain.
Right.
But anyway, working copy as a built-in diff tool. So a diff tool is a split screen comparison of two versions of the same text file. And when there's a difference, it gets colored, it gets highlighted with a specific color. And that's a tool that IA Writer does not offer. So by integrating these two apps, not only can I share my documents with somebody else, but also I can take advantage of the tools that Working Copy makes available thanks to its built-in version history. And not only that, but from Working Copy, I can even drag out individual versions of the same file. So for example, I can pick a version of the file management chapter from May 15 and compare it to a version from May 6th of the same document and use Kaleidoscope on my iPad Pro, which is an even more advanced diff tool made by the folks at Black Pixel to compare, for example, edits that I applied and edits that Ryan applied to the document. So it's a very advanced sort of niche feature, but I guess the main, and this is one of the main sections of the story, the kind of thing that I wanted to highlight was the opening place and file bookmarks APIs in iOS, in the context of some folks still think of iPad and iOS file management as this old and limited and slow sort of process, but in reality, if developers like the folks of IA Writer and Anders Borum, he makes Working Copy, if developers actually take advantage of modern APIs, they can craft these more advanced and flexible experiences that perhaps some people are not familiar with. And that was one of my goals with this story, to sort of shine a light on these more advanced flavors of file management.
Yeah, it's interesting to me too, because essentially what you're doing also is creating redundancy in a lot of your writing, so you're less likely to lose things.
Oh yeah. It's funny you should mention that.
Funny I should mention that. Well, when you started talking about the meta story in the story, I immediately thought about the day when you texted me and said you thought you had lost basically a half a day's editing, right? Kind of early on in the editing process too, right? When you were still staring down the barrel of many days of editing, right?
Yeah, I was stupid, and because as you mentioned, IA Writer and Working Copy, when they integrate with each other, they create redundancy in that each version of every time you save in IA Writer, it gets mirrored to Working Copy, and then if you sync Working Copy with GitHub, it also gets pushed online. But I was testing a beta of Working Copy, and I was reckless because you shouldn't test betas for your production work, but I did it anyway because I needed to test a new feature, and in doing so, I did not take the necessary measures to make sure that I would also run a manual backup of my draft. And so, because it was a beta, I ran into a bug that basically overwrote an afternoon's worth of edits. And I was really upset and I was really sad because until a few weeks ago, I was very tired. Like, I was exhausted. Doing this story in this time frame basically physically and emotionally destroyed me, and so at some point. And so the thought of having lost 5 hours of edits, that was unbearable, honestly. And I was texting Sylvia, like, what do I do? I felt like I wanted to cry, honestly. But then I remembered, I have a Mac Mini that is always on, and Time Machine is enabled. And thankfully, the Mac Mini had saved a time machine backup of the file just before it got overwritten by my stupidity, essentially. So the edits were saved, and I was very happy, and I didn't cry anymore. So that was good. But also, I was stupid. Lesson learned.
The iPad story was saved by a Mac. How about that?
Yeah, that's very poetic and very funny. But I learned my lesson, and I put together a shortcut that creates 2 additional layers of backup for every time I save a story. One in iCloud Drive in a separate folder, and another in Dropbox.
It's those kind of stories that cause you to do things like that. I mean, because I still have some Hazel scripts that are running various kinds of backups on iWork documents, because I remember that horror story that Mike Hurley talked about on Connected one time, I know, and he had lost a whole bunch of work that he was doing for Relay one afternoon, and it was just gone. And I don't know that he ever figured out what happened to it, but I now have Hazel rules set up so that all the spreadsheets that you and I use to run different parts of Mac stories immediately, as soon as they're changed, get shuffled off to somewhere else. So there's a backup of a backup of a backup of all that stuff. So hopefully it never goes away, because I'd have a hard time recreating some of those complex spreadsheets.
Yeah, it's something. It's definitely something that I will keep in mind for the future for my iOS review. Never again,
Yeah.
testing betas for production work without having additional layers of backup. That was just crazy.
So Federico, you and I have spoken a lot this year about things we'd like to see come in shortcuts in iOS 13. So I'm not gonna ask you to kind of go back through your wish list. I think people are fairly familiar with this, but I have one question for you, and that is, you have a lot of wishes for shortcuts, but if there was only one thing that you could change, if only one of your wishes could be granted, which of those things would it be? Because I have an idea myself, and maybe we should compare notes. I'm just curious what yours would be.
Yeah, it's a simple answer. I want to see a third-party developer API for developers to integrate directly with shortcuts, to move beyond, because it's about time, URL schemes. It's about time the developers should be able to integrate their apps and app actions directly with shortcuts, so that basically what I'm envisioning is the ability for users to have third-party actions that are just as native and just as secure and just as powerful as, for example, the reminders actions or the Apple Music actions or the Apple Notes actions. And those are all first-party, built-in native integrations made by Apple. And I want to see that framework, that technology become available for third-party developers. And this is where writing for the web sort of helps in letting readers visualize what you're talking about. Because we talked about this on the show before, but on a podcast, it's more difficult to sort of help people explain what I mean.
Right.
But in the web version, there's a screenshot that shows you, here's the things, the action for things by Culture Code. And it looks nice, but actually it's not a native action. And that allowed me to compare what it looks like to have a fancy looking action that is actually not a built-in one compared to reminders. Speaking of which, that one of my favorite sort of visual moments from the story is when I think it's in the problems of file management section. I say something like, imagine if you could set up a connection to an external server in the Files app, and imagine if you could enter a username and a password and a URL for the server, and it will look something like this. And there's a screenshot that shows you connecting to a WebDAV server
Yes.
in Files. And then I say, except you don't need to imagine anything, because that's already a feature that Apple Pages supports right now. It's just a private API.
Right. Yeah, no, that was really good. I like that a lot. I think when I answer this, I'm tempted to answer the same as you, but I think I would go with the time-based and geo-based triggers of shortcuts.
Interesting.
Just because I think that would leverage existing shortcuts so much and make them so much more useful. If I was just only allowed one, I think I would pick that one, because I think everything that I've already got would work so much better if I could do it on a schedule or say when I arrive at my house or things like that. But I totally get where you're coming from with the APIs too.
Yeah.
Federico, what are the lessons learned from this story? I mean, I know you've spent a lot of time since the beginning of the year reevaluating kind of where you've been with the iPad and where you're going and thinking a little bit about how it's fit into your life and why it works for you as opposed to, using a Mac full time or whatever it happens to be. What are some of the big picture lessons you've learned and kind of reflecting on all those things?
I guess the main idea, which is also the title of the story, is I wanted to show how working on the iPad can go beyond what people may assume that a tablet does. So the idea that in some people's minds, there's still the default assumption of tablet, meaning simple computer that cannot do the serious things that a real computer can do. And so showing how I was able to address some of the traditional computing tasks like managing files or dealing with downloads with a web browser or connecting to an external display or recording podcasts. So dealing with traditional tasks but in a new environment and in a modernized environment. So going beyond the assumption that a tablet is only good for reading books or playing games. And I guess the second underlying current and the theme, second major theme of the story is there's some features and some ideas that the Mac and macOS 10, now called macOS, figured out decades ago. And I guess the idea of coming to terms with the fact that some of these ideas are still good and are still the best implementation or the best solution to a problem that you can possibly come up with. And what I would like to see is Apple learning from that tradition of the Mac, but without having to straight up copy the Mac. So taking the essence of an idea, but modernizing it for touch and for the iPad and iOS, and sort of striking that balance of what is it that works about this concept, about this feature, about this idea, and how can we bring it into a modern age and sort of maybe trying to make it more intuitive or make it work for multi-touch. That would be, I guess, the second major theme of the story. And generally speaking, I tried to tackle this story on three fronts. There's the historical context, and so sort of each section has some background on where things used to be like and used to work like on iPad. There's my current setup, and so trying to describe the possibilities of working on the iPad today by using my own setup as an example. And you can see this in file management, you can see this in automation, you can see this in podcasting. And there's also the looking ahead at the future and sort of the things that I would like Apple to work on next and the problems that I would like Apple to fix and sort of my wishes for the future of the iPad platform. So these three different angles that are sort of embedded in each chapter of the story. So I would say these would be the major themes and the major ideas and sort of how I tried to approach this story. And I think for the first time, there really isn't, when I work on my iOS reviews, I'm always left with the feeling that there's more that I could have done. There's something that I left out.
Mm-hmm.
But for the first time, I'm pretty happy that this is all like a complete account of at least all the things that I knew that I wanted to address. It's got all the little things and all the apps and all the examples that I wanted to have. And I don't feel like at this point in time, and this is why I did it right now before WWDC, because if I published it after WWDC, then I would have to account for, well, but there's a beta coming out.
Right.
And instead, what I wanted to do was a document that at this point in time, with iOS 12, right on the cusp of WWDC, before iOS 13, this is what working on the iPad for the past 7 years has been like. And it's like like drawing a line in the sand. And after this point, with iOS 13, we'll see what happens. But that was my goal, to have something that would document the state of the iPad and my experience with the iPad before WWDC, so that going into the event, I can compare and I can see, this feature in iOS 13, is this what I wanted? And sort of having this story for reference, I think is gonna be great in terms of when I'm gonna work on the iOS 13 review. I will not have to offer as much historical context in September because I can just refer back to this story. So
Right.
it's something that I really wanted to do, and mostly for myself, really. But of course, I hope that it can be useful for other people. So that was I guess my end goal was to have a document ready before iOS 13, before whatever happens at WWDC, and especially before the iPad's 10th anniversary next year, which is coming up in January. So that's crazy.
That is amazing. Well, you know what? I think you've done a terrific job. And this is the kind of story that I love to see you write, because you've talked about some aspects of what's in this story here and there, on this show, on other podcasts that you do, in articles for the club and articles on the site, but you've brought it all together in kind of a coherent whole that explains not just how to work on the iPad, but kind of the why that you work on the iPad and what you get out of it. And I think, especially as you said, because we're at the point now where iOS 12 is basically done. I mean, I know we saw a 12.4 beta, but iOS 12 is basically finished. And before long, just a couple of weeks, we're going to have iOS 13, at least in beta. And it's a great way to have a measuring stick. Now we can look and say, all right, well, here's what happened with iOS 13. And, here are the things that we had hoped for that are missing. Here are the things that we didn't expect. Here are the things that are done better than we expected. It's a good way to kind of bring that all together in one place.
Yeah, thank you. I'm really happy to hear that. So yeah, that was I did it. It took me 3 months, and now it'll be nice to have a break of a few weeks before I start working on something that will also require me 3 months. So
yeah, I was going to say, I hope you get a little rest, but I know that we've got enough other things going on that there's not going to be a whole lot of rest for any of us, I don't think, for the next several months.
What is it they say? There is no rest for the wicked. So
yeah, that's right. That's us. That's definitely us. This episode of App Stories is brought to you by Linode. With Linode, you can instantly deploy and manage an SSD server in the Linode cloud. And you can get a server up and running in just seconds with your choice of Linux distro, resources, and node location. It doesn't matter if you're working on your very first server or deploying a complex system. Linode are the folks to go to. They offer the fastest hardware and network with outstanding customer support if you ever need help. It's super easy to launch a Linode cloud server, and their block storage is available in Newark, Fremont, Dallas, Atlanta, Frankfurt, London, and Singapore, and soon, Tokyo. Version 4 of Linode's RESTful API is out of beta and includes an officially supported Python CLI. And right now, Linode are hiring. If you want to learn more and check out what they're looking for, go to linode.com/careers. Okay, let's talk about pricing, because the pricing is fantastic. Linode has options to suit everyone's needs. Their plans start at 1 gigabyte of RAM for just $5 a month, and they offer high memory plans starting with 16 gigabytes of RAM. And Linode have a special offer just for App Stories listeners. As a listener of this show, you can go to linode.com/appstories and use the promo code AppStories2019 to get $20 toward any Linode plan. On the 1 gigabyte of RAM plan, that's 4 free months. And with a 7-day money-back guarantee, you have nothing to lose. So give Linode a try today. That's linode.com/appstories and the promo code AppStories2019 to learn more, sign up, and make the most of that $20 credit. Our thanks to Linode for supporting App Stories. Well, thanks for sharing all that with us, Federico. Now we're going to turn to Brian King, because Brian helped Federico put together the animation that you see at the very beginning of his story, as well as some of the other images that you see throughout at the chapter sections and that sort of thing. Welcome to the show, Brian.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So Brian, can you just briefly introduce yourself and tell us what you do, and I suppose how you came across Mac Stories a few years ago?
So I've got a background in video and design. I spent about 10 years working in LA. I did some feature film stuff, some commercial stuff. And I started to get more and more clients in technology and flying up here to Silicon Valley more often. So I just kind of shifted over from reality shows and movies to apps and startups. And I like this world so much better.
So I can tell you, John, that the how this happened was very simple.
Okay.
I was planning on not doing a special layout for the story. Like it was going to be a regular post on the website.
Sure.
But then the more I kept thinking about it, and I felt bad, because it wouldn't justify all the effort that I put into the story. So one morning I woke up, and I don't know how, but I remembered Brian sending me a tweet a few years ago, I think a couple of years ago, saying, "No, the next time you need to do some kind of animation or video, feel free to get in touch, and I would love to work on something like that."
I think that happened. I had a crazy desk set up a couple years ago in LA, and I think you ran that in Mac Stories, one of the early Mac Stories,
Yes,
or Club
yes.
Mac Stories newsletters.
Yeah.
And
I do remember
yeah,
that.
we're talking about that story, and I said, hey, if you need videos, that's the only thing I'm good at.
So one morning I was just sipping my coffee, and I had this thought, and so out of the blue I just messaged Brian. I was like,
That's amazing.
"Would you like
I
to
love that
work on
story.
this?" So this was my approach. I guess, right, Brian, can you walk us through, from your perspective, sort of what my request sounded like to you, and sort of how you approached working on this project?
Yeah. And I woke up to a DM from you. I think it's the week that I was in the middle of moving house, so it's impeccable timing.
I'm sorry.
But that's how it happens. But you sent me a link to the iOS 12 review, and you said we're thinking about doing some more animations like this. What can you do? And it was all very doable in like Photoshop and After Effects, but I thought maybe if I did this in 3D, we'd have a little bit more flexibility, and we'd be able to do some graphics that you don't really see on other blogs that are using the same Photoshop templates or the same shortcuts workflows. That let's put a screen on a thing. I want to spin the phone around. Let's shine some lights.
To me, taking the approach of using 3D has really made the story special, because it's not like anything that I've seen anywhere before myself. And what kind of hardware and apps are you using to do that? So you mentioned you're not using kind of like what we're probably most familiar with, Federico and me, is people doing things in Sketch or Photoshop or whatever it is, as you said. I mean, what were you using to put some of this together?
Yeah, and I have a lot of background of sticking 2D screens onto footage. So I've done a lot of app and startup commercials, and most of the time that is with After Effects or with Photoshop. But this time, especially since the screens aren't square anymore, they're not nice, neat rectangles, it's gotten a lot more complicated. So, I started playing around in Cinema 4D, which is a 3D compositing app, to see what I could do with iPhone models and iPad models in there. And actually, Cinema 4D, a lot of people wouldn't use this. There's a free 3D app called Blender that a lot of people use.
Right.
There's Maya, there's 3ds Max. I started off with Cinema 4D like 10 years ago when I was working in news graphics. So it was fun for me because my entire history with Cinema 4D has been like taking text and making it shiny, like making shiny news headlines.
Right.
So it was a fun shift to put some products in there.
Well, that's really interesting. So what kind of computer are you using to do this stuff?
So at home with the initial sketches, I just used my MacBook Pro. I had a second MacBook Pro from work that I was using to make a little render farm. And then once things got a little bit more complex and the renders started taking longer, I took it to work where I have an iMac Pro. I also have a Mac Pro. I have a big PC. So it's actually a lot of hardware working together to render these things out faster.
So when you start a project like this, though, what's the first step? Like, what's a rough draft look like when you're working in 3D?
I'd love to say like I thumbnailed out and I drew these nice little sketches of iPads floating around, but what's cool about 3D is you don't need to do that, and it's actually faster to build a basic 3D environment, just to build kind of the 3D equivalent to a white backdrop to a photo shoot, and throw in some models and spin them around and move your camera until you have something you like.
Oh, okay.
Like the iteration process in 3D is a lot more loose because it's like you're playing with physical objects that are just floating in space.
Sure. And the models you're using, are those something that you buy like stock art, or are they things you create, or how does that work?
Yeah, exactly. You can buy these models. We used a site called TurboSquid, and you can just swap out what's on the screens or swap out what color the bezel is or what color the aluminum is. So you get these models so you can play with the textures and then manipulate them.
Oh, okay. So then once you would have something and you were ready to, maybe show it to Federico and see what he thought of it, did you have to go through like a full render process, or is there like some kind of intermediary version that you could send him to kind of get his feedback on things?
The tricky bit, and a thing that I've learned in my years working in editing and in VFX for other projects, is I can always screenshot what I'm sketching and like the wireframe models and the stuff with a bunch of reference lines and grids and weird stuff all over the screen, but it never really gets the same effect for people who aren't familiar with seeing that kind of interface. So I'd usually render out something in a little bit lower render quality, screenshot that, and send it over.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. I saw some of that.
As you can imagine, I was not able to visualize when he was sending me those reference images. I was like, yeah, I think I get it, but I would prefer to see the render because
it's messy. Every light that I have in the scene, it shows a bunch of lines shooting out where the light is. Every camera I have in the scene has a little cartoon wireframe camera that tells me, hey, there's a camera over here. And all that stuff really gets in the way if you're not used to filtering it out.
Right. Federico showed me a couple of those, and they're really interesting to me because you do get a sense for how it's built, but it is very hard if you're not used to that to visualize what the end product will end up looking at like.
I'm curious to ask you, Brian, from my perspective, it felt like perhaps the biggest challenge was trying to make the desk happen. In terms of trying to make it realistic, with the addition of the HomePod, which came later, sort of the reflections that I asked you to make a white glossy desk to sort of replicate my real desk at home. And I know that there's been a bunch of back and forth there because it required a lot of rendering time. And then we added the colored strip light in the back of the desk. So sort of, can you describe the challenge of that particular scene?
Yeah, it was tricky because, like I said in the past, I've just worked with like text. I've done a little bit of product stuff in cinema, but it's the first project I've had where Uncanny Valley is actually a problem because I'd show you a render, and initially you and a couple of my friends that I was showing the renders to were saying, oh my God, is this a photo? And it's not, but then once we started doing things like making that white reflective desk, then it starts to get a little bit trickier to make it, how to make it look real enough, but still understand that it's a render, but still not think you're looking at a photo. There's a fine balance there. But with the desk itself, I mean, inside these 3D programs, you create a texture and you say, this is kind of plasticky and it's this reflective, and the reflections have this much diffusion in them. They make things this blurry. And it's just a lot of tweaking settings, and then you render out, if you have a big giant picture, you render out a tiny piece of it. Just to see, when I was working on it, I was looking at how the tip of the pencil was reflecting on the desk. And then from that, I was figuring out what settings I needed to work with for everything else.
Yeah, because the really impressive part is if you play the video over and over, and it's only 3 to 4 seconds, so you really gotta hit the refresh button and take a look at the animation again. But you can see all of those reflections moving in real time on the desk. So the HomePod and the screen of the ultrafine display, you can see the reflection of the apps moving on the desk. I think it's really remarkable how it looks realistic, but it doesn't. I remember one of the earlier versions of the render, it was kind of bothering me from a visual perspective because of that uncanny valley problem. This is a nice balance of sort of trying to do a render, but also photorealism. I think it's a nice balance there. So I wanted to ask you, can you give us more details about the actual rendering time of the animation and putting all of this together?
Yeah, and just I want to roll it back a little bit and talk about the actual scene. And if I was a lot more skilled or had a lot more time, I would have played with, making the desk a little bit damaged and pockmarked. Like if you ever watch a Pixar movie, things are trashed. Like the baseboards inside houses are beat up, the carpeting has weird stains and inconsistencies. And we didn't do that on our desk surface. It scatters the reflections a little bit, but it's definitely not, it doesn't look like my white desk. Probably doesn't look like your white desk. So I think that's part of where we made that balance between making it photorealistic and me not being a professional 3D guy as much as I'd like to be. When it comes to building the scene itself, though, Cinema 4D and 3D apps they're cool because you get to build things like you would build them in a photo studio. So I laid down a surface and I said, "You're the desk." I put a texture on it that's like a shiny white desk. But under that desk, there are simulated lights, and I said, "It's this kind of light. It's aimed this way. It's that bright." And then to make it look like an orange light strip, but a little bit more diffused, I made a physical. It's like a big orange strip of translucent plastic. So if we rotate the camera around, you see this piece of translucent plastic at the edge of the desk with lights shining through it. And that's how I got that light. And it's fun for me coming from a background that's deeper in photography and cinematography. It's fun for me to come up with those solutions because it's not me saying I'm not great at Cinema 4D, but I need to make a light that's exactly this diffuse, that's placed exactly here. I can say, in real life, I would take a piece of colored plastic and I'd shoot a light through it, and I got to do just that. And that's a great freedom that this software lets me do.
Yeah, that's really interesting, especially since, I mean, if you were doing it as a photographer, you have to deal with, I don't know, all the messiness of the real world, whereas in software you're doing it, but it's just tools, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, and when I do physical product photography, I have to worry about not showing a light stand, or I have to worry about the reflection off of somebody's shirt. If I'm using a white backdrop, somebody's wearing an orange shirt, there's going to be some orange in that. And inside cinema, not only do you not need to physically support things like your lights and your cameras and your devices, but you can say, hey, while you're rendering, this object is not seen by this light. Or if the glass on the front of the iPad isn't behaving, I can disable that glass and just have a straight up view of the screen. And that's something you just cannot do in real life.
Right. So once a render, so the total length of the video that's at the top of the article is what, 3 or 4 seconds long? Is that right?
4 seconds, I think.
Yeah, it's about 4 seconds of motion, then it settles down.
So I guess 2 questions. One is, how long did it take you to render that once you had kind of the final product and you were ready to put together the final file? And just how big was that file?
The final version of that, I think we had a total of 32 cores working on it between 2 MacBook Pros and iMac Pro, a big PC that I use at work. And that was about 2 days of rendering.
Wow.
And the file sizes, they aren't big because it spits out, it's a QuickTime video that it ends up spitting out. It's just like if you took a camera, pointed it at a screen, and then moved the camera back. So
okay,
that's a couple hundred megs. It's not a big deal. And the file size of the project is relatively small, too. There's a big folder full of all the textures I use, but all the 3D stuff is just very basic instructions saying, hey, there's 50 cubes over here, and they're shaped like that.
Right.
So the file sizes aren't that big. It's just the processor and the CPU saying, this is exactly how the light scatters on the 4th bounce coming off of this light. That takes a little bit of time to figure out.
All right, I get it. So is this the kind of thing that like an eGPU would help with if you like were to plug that into the MacBook?
So that really depends on there are different renderers out there, different instructions that the computer has to say this is how the scene looks. And in my case, I'm using Cinema 4D's physical renderer, which is very realistic. It does really good stuff with light, but it only uses CPUs. There are GPU renderers out there. Some of them only work with AMD. Some kind of work with NVIDIA. Like, there's a lot of very fine details of what you can and can't render with a GPU. So in my case, eGPUs wouldn't have done anything, but it's definitely a possibility for other software and other renderers.
Sure. So the file size wasn't huge, but when you're talking about loading a website, a couple of 100 megs is pretty hefty, which this file is not. It's much smaller. I think Federico can probably speak to that a little better than I can. But what was how was that? How was the video encoded and kind of translated to be web friendly?
Yeah, we actually got this one down to, I think we're at 4.5 megabytes, and
4.8, I think.
Right, we're down to 4.8 megabytes. We encoded with HEVC or H.265. That helped a lot with the quality. So we were initially encoding without HEVC, and it looked very pixelated. And switching it over to HEVC it's a better compression algorithm.
It's one of those things where I don't know that a lot of people are as familiar with how good that compression algorithm is, but especially in cases like this, I think, make a big difference compared to other options that are available.
Yeah, HEVC, it made a huge difference. I remember when H.264 first came out, and as a video guy, that was that was just miraculous at the quality that we could get with things that fit within our, our 200 megabyte weekly Vimeo limits. And HEVC is another step like that. And it let that file size get down, but not look chunky and not look like a checkerboard.
Yeah, that was another of those ideas that I had at a random point in my day, or should I say at night, because I was in bed. It was like 3 a.m., 4 a.m., and I was just trying to fall asleep, but I was still thinking about the things that we needed to do. And something just popped in my mind of, why don't you use HEVC and H.265? And it all came to me, and I think I immediately texted Brian, and I said, can we actually use HEVC and see what happens? Because it's actually supported in most modern browsers at this point, so it should be working. And it does work. And if, of course, if there's any other, if somebody tries to open the review and the video doesn't work, it just falls back to the static image. But I guess at this point, Chrome, Safari, Edge, and Opera, if somebody still uses that, they all support H.265, so should be fine. Brian, before we wrap up the show, my last question would be, is there anything else about the static chapter images that you would like to point out? The ones with the multiple iPads and, the crazy layout, like the automation chapter. Is there any detail there that you would like to mention?
Yeah, earlier I was talking about how we get to play with actual physics, and it's just, let's see what the phone looks like if I rotate it around this way, and that doesn't cause any drama with how the screens are superimposed on them. And I had a lot of fun with the physics when it came to, hey, let's have 6 iPads on screen, but maybe I can make that 40 iPads on screen. And Cinema 4D has things built in that I can say, take this one thing and remake it 20 times and put it in this pattern. So I manipulated a lot of those effectors and a lot of those different cloners to get, for example, in the automation chapter, we see the iPads kind of twisting off into the distance, but they're all doing it in a very uniform way. And so that was something I haven't really explored before. That was kind of my middle of the night idea. It's like, oh, what if I use the cloner and then I combine it with this randomizer and then rotate everything by 2 degrees? Like, playing with the different ways to manipulate those iPads was really fun. I also used some actual physics and gravity. So there are some tests that we didn't use where I took a bunch of iPads, I floated them in the air, and then I said, all right, now let's turn on gravity and let's make that desk a surface. And all the iPads would fall down and be in kind of a pile, sometimes around the HomePod or around a bunch of pencils. And it allowed us to get kind of product shots that would be impossible to get if we didn't go out and buy dozens of iPads.
Right.
So it was another one of those things where it's what can't we pull off in Photoshop and what can't we pull off with a camera and an iPad? And the answer is, we can clone iPads and we can throw them on the floor and we can have just stacks and stacks of them.
Wow, that's really fascinating. Brian, I want to thank you for being with us today. It was really interesting talking to you about this. I want to make a special note, though, for club members, because at Club Mac Stories, we're going to have Brian do a special behind the scenes. He's going to go into a little more depth about all these things that he did to help with this story, and that'll be in Mac Stories weekly on Friday. So thanks again, Brian, and we'll talk to you soon. I look forward to reading your article.
Of course. Thanks for having me.
Okay, Federico, I want to thank our 2 sponsors again for this week, Linode and Lunar Display. We'll be back next week with another episode of App Stories. You can find me and Federico, of course, over at macstories.net. Federico is on Twitter and Instagram as Viticci, that's Viticci, and I'm at John Voorhees, JohnVoorhees. Talk to you next week, Federico.
Ciao, John.